Hello everyone, I'm Diganta, and I'll be presenting my lecture on Sarah Perry. So Sarah Perry was born in England and she grew up in a devout Catholic Christian family. And when she was growing up, she had a lot of, she participated in a lot of church-related activities. She was very thorough with the King James Bible. And in many ways, we'll see how these questions of faith, which we find in her novel, is brought out from her own lives. And primarily in this lecture, we'll be talking about this conflict between curiosity and faith and how or whether or not at all this conflict is resolved. So, hello everyone once again, and the lecture is titled Look into the Closet, Curiosity and Exploration in Sarah Perry's Enlightenment. So before I go into the lecture, I'll start with a brief history of this idea of curiosity. So the word curiosity can be traced back to its Latin root, cura, which means concern or care. And there are two derivatives. One is curiositas, which means a desire for knowledge, a desire for exploration, a desire to learn and discover. And the second derivative is curiosus, which means someone who is extremely diligent, someone who is attentive to detail and is extremely careful. So these are the main roots from which the word curiosity originates. Now, in Albert Manguel's book on curiosity, he observes how this Spanish lexicographer, Sebastian de Covarrubias, considered the term curioso, which is the same in Latin and Spanish, to have two meanings. So, and I quote, the first meaning is positive and the second meaning is negative. The second connotation is negative. Positive because the curious person treats things diligently, and negative because the person labors to scrutinize things that are most hidden and reserved and do not matter. Now, very interestingly, these two connotations which are there, one is a positive connotation and one is a negative connotation, both these seem to contradict each other. However, this second negative connotation, which associates curiosity with a kind of inquisitiveness which is not warranted, opens up, according to Manguel, the ground for the biblical condemnation of curiosity as an, and I quote, illicit yearning to know what is forbidden. So Manguel observes that this second meaning of curiosity, which has a negative connotation, paves the way for the negative connotation within the domains of religion. And if we come to the 14th century, during the medieval period, we find that this negative connotation is used in a very prominent manner. Why? Because in the medieval context, this term curiosity is used in cases where someone has an excessive interest in worldly things and has an intellectual pride. Now, within the context of religion, this was considered to be something which distanced you from spiritual matters, which distanced you from spiritual devotion. However, even in the medieval period, there is a positive connotation which survives. And interestingly, this deals with the idea of a work of art or deals with the idea of workmanship. So this positive connotation in the medieval period is an aesthetic connotation, wherein the word curiosity symbolizes a skill or clever workmanship, a sense of elegance in that workmanship, and a sense of beauty when we're talking about in the context of a work of art. For example, in the 14th century poem, The House of Fame, Chaucer, while observing the castle of Lady Fame, talks about it, and I quote, great craft, beauty, the cast, the curiosity. So this curiosity, which Chaucer talks about in this poem, this curiosity is the curiosity which has this aesthetic connotation. That is, he compares or he talks about the beauty of this castle and how it achieves a sublime status, because the speaker says that he fails to describe in words the beauty which is inherent in this castle. So this particular idea of curiosity, which is related to a work of art, can also be seen in the medieval period. Now, coming to the 16th and 17th centuries, after the period of Renaissance and the Enlightenment age, when questions of rationality, when questions of reasoning came to the forefront, we find curiosity becomes a tool, an epistemological tool. For what? For challenging the existing ideas about the foundations of the universe. So in the 16th or following the 16th and 17th centuries, whenever we find a reference to the word curiosity, it becomes a tool for developing new systems of knowledge through scientific exploration, experimentation, and inquiry. So this is an overall, if you can see on the screen, an overall development of the word curiosity over the ages. So from cura, we have a positive connotation, which means a curious person is a person who treats things diligently. And from the same root, we have this positive connotation in the medieval period, which means a skilled or clever workmanship or a beauty of a work of art. And from there, we have the idea of curiosity as a tool for understanding and exploring the universe, which develops in the 16th and 17th centuries. If we talk about the negative connotations, we have, as we saw, we have the idea of curiosity in terms of someone who is excessively interested in the affairs of others, who is excessively interested in discovering something which is meant to be hidden. And from that, we have the medieval religious connotation of curiosity almost as a sin, something which should be despised, something which should be controlled, because it distances you from religion, from spiritual devotion. So these are the main roots of this word which we find. And these different connotations of curiosity are extremely important when we are talking about Sarah Perry's Enlightenment. So now coming to the main novel, when we are talking about Sarah Perry's Enlightenment, there is another important idea of curiosity which we should look into, and that is Plutarch's conception of curiosity in a particular treatise which is called On Being a Busybody. So in On Being a Busybody, which was written between 1st and 2nd century CE, Plutarch says once again that curiosity has two connotations. On the one hand, he says that curiosity characterizes the desire to know about the trouble of others, the desire to know about the faults of others, the desire to know about the conversations of others. So this is a negative connotation we are talking about once again. So when Plutarch talks about curiosity in his treatise, he says that when you are curious about someone else's problems, the faults in others, then you tend to miss the faults in your own understanding of selfhood. That is how he treats it in a negative way. However, there's a difference in Plutarch's idea of curiosity and the negative connotation of curiosity, which we just saw, which developed during the medieval period. Why? Because Plutarch says that instead of directing your curiosity towards other people, you should use that same curiosity to study how the universe operates. And this was something which during the 14th century was considered once again in terms of sin, because the material universe or developments or the reasoning of the material universe was considered to be beyond the purview of human understanding. But when Plutarch is writing about curiosity, he says that we should direct our curiosity towards aspects of the universe. And I'll quote him here where he says, direct your curiosity to heavenly things and things on earth, in the air, in the sea. Are you by nature fond of small or of great spectacles? If of great ones, apply your curiosity to the sun Where does it set and where does it rise? Inquire into the changes in the moon as you would into those of a human being. What becomes of all the light she has spent, and from what source did she regain it? So basically, then Plutarch is asking us to use our curiosity to understand the mechanism of the universe. Now, when we come to enlightenment, we see that both these aspects of curiosity, the positive and negative, which Plutarch talks about, is found in Sarah Perry's novel. On the one hand, as you can see, we have the idea of curiosity as exploration, the positive connotation. So when we talk about this idea of curiosity as exploration, we come to the character of Thomas Hart, our protagonist, who is a writer who works for this newspaper called the Essex Chronicle. Now, when he's working as a writer, his editor, Nick Carlton, asks him one day to write a report or write a piece on astronomy, on the stars, on comets. And initially, Thomas Hart is extremely disappointed, or he doesn't want to do this job because he has no former interest in astronomy. So when his editor, Nick Carlton, asks him to write a report, initially he's extremely confused as to how to look at the sky, how to discover the various comets and the constellations. But gradually he develops an interest towards this cosmic space. And that is the point when his role as an explorer, when this idea of curiosity as exploration begins. On the other hand, we have another character who is called James Bower, who is working in Essex Museum Services. So James Bower invites Thomas Hart and says that he has found some documents related to a woman who has disappeared in this Lowlands house. And there is this myth which is there in this novel about the Lowlands ghost, about this ghost of a woman who has been seen frequently. So James Bower invites Thomas Hart to research into this disappearance of this woman. And as the story progresses, we find that this woman is a Romanian woman by the name of Maria Vadua, who had discovered a comet when she was alive. And somehow her name has not been associated with that discovery. So on the one hand, then Thomas Hart has just started his study of stars and comets. And on the other hand, he's invited by James Bower to study the life of a man, the life of a woman who was interested in astronomy, who had discovered this comet. So this begins Hart's journey as an explorer, and this starts this idea of curiosity as exploration in this particular novel. However, it is important to note that all these elements of curiosity which are developed in this novel takes place alongside Hart's own development of selfhood. So there are different social and personal relationships which Hart has in this city of Arley, where he lives. So there is this chapel called the Bethesda Chapel. And in that chapel, he had met this little girl who had lost her mother when she was just after birth. And this little girl was named Grace Macaulay. And Grace Macaulay had held the finger of Thomas Hart when he was in Bethesda Chapel. So Thomas Hart is extremely fond of this little girl called Grace Macaulay and almost treats her as his own daughter. Then we have Grace's father, Richard, and at the same time, we also have her aunt, Anne. So all these people who form a part of Thomas Hart's world play an important role in the development of his selfhood. And this development of selfhood takes place through his constant curious exploration of the sky. And that is what we will be looking at in this lecture. However, so this is about the positive side of curiosity. However, there is also this aspect, this negative aspect of curiosity, which Plutarch had talked about, wherein Plutarch had said that when you're excessively inquisitive about the troubles, about the faults of others, that curiosity Plutarch calls a malady or a malaise of the mind. So this idea of curiosity as social malaise is also found in Enlightenment. And that is expressed through this character called Lorna Green, who is Anne McCullough's friend. So what happens is that Thomas Hart has gradually falls in love with this person called James Bower, who had invited him to discover the mysteries of the Lowlands ghost. However, Thomas Hart represses his homosexual desires towards James Bower because he's frightened, he's afraid that if he expresses his desires, then maybe the people in that city won't accept him. That is why Hart is extremely careful about the expression of his desires. So Hart divides his time between London, wherein he goes to London, and it is in London where he expresses himself openly. He has these romantic relationships. But when he comes back to Adley, he makes sure to repress all his desires. So in one such journey, Thomas Hart is returning from London, and there is this boy who is sitting with him and with whom Hart has had a romantic connection. Now, as the train is approaching the station, on the opposite side, we have Lorna Green and Anne Macaulay. Uh, they're, they're having their food. And what happens is that Lorna looks over Anne Macaulay's shoulder and sees that boy kissing Thomas Hart. And the text reads, I'll just quote from the text, Lorna, and I quote, looked with distaste over Anne's shoulder. She shuddered with a delicate motion of her blouse that let out puffs of scent and suggested that briefly she had seen some tawdry thing. So this gesture of looking over is almost indicates that Lorna is prying into Thomas Hart's life. So this curiosity as a social malaise, wherein Lorna not only interferes with Hart's desires, Hart's romantic relationships, but also, as we later see in the novel, she uses this knowledge against Thomas Hart, and she reveals this knowledge to the people at the Chapel of Bethesda, wherein everyone publicly, in a way, shames Thomas Hart for his homosexuality. So Lorna Green, in a way, forms a part of this idea of curiosity as a social malaise, and this gesture of looking over is therefore extremely significant. Now we move on to the idea of the ghostly presence in Enlightenment. And the ghostly presence here refers to the ghost of Maria Vaduva. So in this particular lecture, we won't be focusing much on Lorna's aspect of curiosity. Primarily, we'll be focusing on Hart's sense of curiosity and how that sense of curiosity helps him understand his own self, helps him come to terms with his own homosexual desires, wherein he is able to kind of find a place when he can find the middle ground between his faith and his nature, because we find that Thomas Hart is constantly going to Bethesda Chapel. So he has a sense of attachment to Bethesda Chapel because he has been going there for long. He has met Grace Macaulay there. But at the same time, when he sees that these people are extremely prejudiced, when he sees that these people do not accept him for who he is, from that point onwards, he stopped going to the chapel. So there is this conflict, and in the novel mentions that there's this conflict between Hart's faith, religious faith, which is constantly telling him that you are a sinner just because of his desires. And on the other hand, we have Hart's sense that he's not doing anything wrong. He's just trying to express his love for James Bower. So this conflict goes on throughout the novel, and the resolution of this conflict is achieved only through Hart's exploration of the cosmic space. So when we are talking about the ghostly presence in Enlightenment, we see that when Thomas Hart is discovers the letters of Maria Vadua, he is creating a picture of her through the letters and documents he reads. So he doesn't know how Maria Vadua was in reality. But the only piece of information he has is that Maria Vadua, who loved a person by the name of M, and her love was also not returned, just in the same way as his love for James Bower will never be returned because James Bower is a straight man. So this pain which Hart constantly experiences, wherein he is forced to repress his desires because he knows that James Bower would not return his love for him, that pain helps him relate to Maria Vadua, who also loved this person called M and whose love was not returned. So that is why Hart becomes extremely engrossed in this discovery about what happened to this person called Maria Vadua and how she gradually disappeared. So the ghostly presence then in Enlightenment is not just a supernatural occurrence, but it is a Gothic reconstruction of a past that is personal and domestic, and that constantly interferes with Hart's presence, because Hart's research into the life of Vadua involves a study of her domestic life with her husband, John Bell, and her unrequited love for this person called M. And like I said, that Hart constantly draws a parallel between Vadua's love for M and his own repressed love for James Bower. Now, the Gothic interference of Vadua in Hart's life is not undesirable. So when Hart is reading her letters, when Hart is reading her documents, he notices that the ghost of Maria Vadua is present in his own home. However, this presence of the ghost is not treated as an invasion of his privacy or as an invasion of the domestic space, as is normally the case with horror literature or Gothic literature. Rather, Hart welcomes the presence of this ghost. And we see at times that when Hart is unable to see the ghost in his room, he becomes extremely disappointed. So in his moments, when Hart is depressed, when Hart is not being able to write, when Hart is confused about his own life, he constantly seeks the presence of Maria Vadua's ghost. So the presence of this ghost is welcomed by Hart. At the same time, we find that this ghost is constructed out of Hart's curiosity about Vadua's life and from the documents and letters pertaining to her life that he discovers, and out of Hart's curious exploration of his own life and sexuality. So the ghost of Maria Vadua is a very literary presence, in the sense that whatever we know about Vadua is an assemblage of all her letters and documents. That is how the character of this person is created. And the narrator comments at one point, and I quote, Maria Vadua Bell, assembled out of ink and speculation and taking up residence on Lower Bridge Road. So Lower Bridge Road is the place where Thomas Hart lives. So the narrator says that Vadua is assembled out of ink and speculation, meaning that she is created out of all these letters and documents that Hart and James Bower discover. So on the one hand, therefore, Vadua is constructed out of these literary documents. But on the other hand, we also have an interpretation where we see that maybe Maria Vadua is just a projection of Hart's own psychological state. Because constantly when Hart feels depressed, we find the presence of Vadua and she is talking to him. So if we go back to the scene wherein Hart is returning from London with this boy, and there is this scene wherein Hart is trying to distance himself from this boy because he's approaching elderly. So he doesn't want people to see that he's coming with this boy. And when he is trying to distance himself from this boy also leans towards the other side. And at this portion, I'll just read a part from this text. The narrator mentions that there was a black-browed person, referring to Vadua, who raps on the train window and says, "You coward Thomas Hart," meaning that Hart's failure to express his desire, that pain he experiences, has been externalized through the character of Vadua. So that is why he sees Vadua, when he is forced to separate himself emotionally and physically from this boy who has come with him from London. We find the presence of Maria Vadua once again, because it is Hart's own mind telling him that he has failed to express his desires for this boy. So therefore, the presence of this ghost in this novel is extremely important, in the sense that it is created out of these letters and documents, and it is created out of Hart's own psychological state. Now, the idea of curating, therefore, is extremely prominent in Enlightenment, because throughout the novel, we see that Hart walks with these letters which he finds, these documents which are sometimes buried in the house of the Lowland, or in the Lowland's house. So this aspect of curating the documents, curating the objects with which Maria Vadua interacted is also important. I'll give a small example. So when Hart and James Bower, they are rummaging amongst Vadua's objects, or the things she used, they discovered this long cylindrical tube. And at first, they suspect that it is a hunting equipment. But towards the end of the novel, we see that this object, which they had mistaken for a hunting equipment, was in reality a telescope which was put in the hands of the statue of Maria Vadua Bell. So that object, when they discover that this object is a telescope, they understand further this interest in astronomy which Maria Vadua had. So therefore, curating these different objects, these different letters, these different documents of Vadua becomes of primary importance in this novel. And interestingly, the word curator comes from the same root as the word curiosity, because curator also comes from the root cura, indicating that for Hart and Bower, revealing the mystery of Vadua is not just something which they do for a cheap thrill, but it is something with which they're deeply associated, for which they deeply care about. So that is why this idea of curating aspects or objects in this novel becomes important. Now, we will move on to the next aspect, which is curiosity and the cosmic space. And we find that one of the points of commonality between Thomas Hart and Maria Vadua is that both of them, they use the cosmic space to escape the realities of their daily mundane life. So before Hart had this topic of this disappeared woman to study, Hart was just going to his office, writing these newspaper articles. And this mundane life which he experienced breaks down when he starts to uncover the realities of Maria Vadua Bell. Similarly, Vadua also uses her interest in the comet as a form of compensation for that unrequited love which she had for M, and that claustrophobic domestic life which she had to lead with her husband in her house. So in the case of Hart, therefore, his curiosity towards the stars and the comets is tied to his interest in Vadua's life that helps him escape his solitary life. So Thomas Hart says at one point that the only way in which he can talk to James Bower is on the pretext of having discovered some new information about Maria, So he calls up James Bower and says that I have discovered some new information. And James Bower comes to his house and then they can have a chat. And Hart says that there is no other way in which he can talk to Bower because, like I said, that Hart constantly is faced with the need to repress his desires within the space of his home, within the space of the city. So the only way in which he can express his love for James Bower is through these interactions which they have about Maria Vadhuva Bell. And that is why Hart is so much invested in her life. So, and even after James Bower dies later in the narrative, we find that Hart continues to pursue his interest in Vadhuva and the comet she had discovered, because that is the only way in which he has trained himself to express his desires. Within the conservative society of Adley, where he has lived throughout his life, he has learned to repress every desire he has had, so much so that even after Bauer's death, the only way in which he can remember him is through the study of the cosmos. And the second reason is that Hart's desire towards Bauer never finds a physical expression. So there is just this one scene in the novel, quite later in the novel, wherein James Bauer meets Hart for one last time, because at this point, Bauer has also learned or understood that Hart's feelings towards him are of a romantic nature. So being a straight man, he tries to avoid Hart so that he doesn't hurt him further. And in this last interaction between Hart and James Bower, Hart says, and I quote, "After all this time, I want to touch you because I never did." And to this, James Bower replies, "You never did, but do you want to? Even now, you can, I am just here." But interestingly, Hart does not touch him because he feels that Bower is saying this thing out of pity. So Hart has never been able to physically express his desire for James Bower. And there's an enormous distance between Hart and Bower, even when they're physically standing close to each other. Very much like the stars that appear to be near but are not. So this absence of physicality becomes even prominent after James Bower dies. So when Hart therefore focuses his interest on the reappearance of Vadhuva's comet, its physicality, as can be seen against the sky, it compensates for Bower's absence in his life. So Vadhuva's comet is supposed to return after a particular interval, and towards the end of his life, Hart is waiting to see that comet because that is the only sense of physicality, the watching that comet, which he can have at this point and which reminds him of James Bower's presence in his life. Otherwise, he has no way in which he can remember all those moments in which James Bower and he himself had spent together pursuing the mystery of Maria Vadhuva Bell. So, unlike the religious space of Bethesda, which is supposed to provide him with some spiritual freedom, the celestial space is not morally charged with prejudiced notions of good and bad. It allows him to freely explore his position within that space and to understand his selfhood against the backdrop of the cosmic world. So when Hart is looking at the comet after it has reappeared after all these years, Hart says, and I quote, "It is indifferent to every kind of doctrine and legislation, and it is universal and is neither sacred nor profane." So Hart's interest in the comet stems from the fact that unlike the space of Bethesda, which continuously judges him, which continuously makes him realize that he doesn't belong there, this celestial space is a space of freedom for him. The celestial space is a place where no amount of regulation or religious doctrine can control or can limit his love for James Bower. And that is the sole reason Hart is so much invested in the reappearance of Maria Vadua Bell and the comet which she had discovered. Now I move on to the next part, which is the metaphor of the orbit in this particular novel. So we find that Hart refers to this to Kepler's idea of the universe, wherein Kepler had said that planets revolve in elliptical orbits, not in circular orbits, but elliptical orbits, which was different from the Copernican or the Ptolemaic universe, which posited that the orbits are circular in nature. Now, this idea of the elliptical orbit is extremely significant in this particular novel because Hart constantly uses these elliptical orbits as a metaphor for the personal relationships which he has in the city of Alhli. So in Alhli, like I said, his primary, the person whom he loves dearly is Grace Macaulay. And Grace Macaulay falls in love with this boy called Nathan. But at one point, what happens is that Nathan promises Grace Macaulay that he will be present when Grace Macaulay is being baptized. However, Nathan is late, and Grace Macaulay doesn't see that Nathan has come to her baptism. But Thomas Hart sees. But what does Thomas Hart do? Thomas Hart turns the boy away and doesn't tell Grace that Nathan had come for her baptism. The reason which Hart gives is that he feels that this boy will betray Grace later on in life. Interestingly, however, just before Thomas Hart comes to this baptism ceremony of Grace Macaulay, he meets James Bower and his wife. So when he meets James Bower and his wife, he feels once again this kind of pain on learning that he can never share the love of James Bower. So after meeting Bower's wife, when he comes to the ceremony of grace and he sees that Nathan and Grace are in love with each other, he develops a sort of jealousy that I am not being able to express my love for James, wherein Nathan is freely able to do so within the confines of the society. And this aspect of jealousy is mentioned by Hart himself in the novel later on. So he doesn't tell Grace about the fact that he's the one who had turned Nathan away. And throughout her life, Grace doesn't marry and she lives a solitary life. And because she thinks that the person whom she loved the most, Nathan, had betrayed her. However, towards the end of Hart's life, Hart informs Grace that he was the one who had turned Nathan away. And from that point onwards, Hart and Grace, they stop talking to each other. So there is this difference or this distance between them. And Thomas Hart says that although there is this distance between them, Grace will obviously return. Just like the planets traveling through this elliptical orbit return, so also Grace is supposed to return. And that is what exactly happens at the end of the novel, wherein we see that although Grace doesn't want to talk to Thomas Hart, but she discovers a piece of clothing which belongs to Maria Vadua Bell. So naturally, her first instinct is to go and tell Thomas Hart that, look, I found this piece of clothing which might be of interest to you. So even though they are not talking with each other, Grace decides to go to Thomas Hart. And this metaphor of return, therefore, is extremely important. And this is once again tied with this idea of elliptical orbits. And in an elliptical orbit, there are two centers of foci. Unlike a circular orbit, which has only one focus, an elliptical orbit has two centers of foci. And this novel shows that at each point in someone's life, there is a different foci or there is a different focus. So I'll come to this particular diagram. So if we take the case of Thomas Hart, at one focal point, we have James Bower, the love of his life. And on the other hand, we have Grace Macaulay. So when Grace Macaulay insults Thomas Hart in the church for his homosexual desires towards James Bower, Hart also stops talking to Grace. So at that point, Hart moves away from Grace Macaulay because at that point he's more focused on James Bower. If we come to this second diagram about Grace Macaulay, so on the one hand, the focal point is located at Thomas Hart because Thomas Hart was the person whom Grace Macaulay has been associated with throughout her life. But on the other hand, we also have her love for Nathan. So because Thomas Hart turns Nathan away, Grace Macaulay decides that she wants to stop talking to Thomas Hart. So this also we have James Bower. On the one hand, we see that uh, he has his own wife, his own family. And at the other focal point, we have Thomas Hart, whom he loves interacting with, but he knows that he cannot return that love Hart has for him. So every individual has multiple focal points, and every individual is traveling across this orbit, moving sometimes closer to one focal point and at other times moving closer to the other focal point. So this is the metaphor of return, which we find in this particular novel. And like I said, that Hart's decision at that point to turn Nathan away is influenced by two factors. On the one hand, he says that he has this protective instinct towards Grace. He doesn't want Grace to suffer. But on the other hand, he also has this jealousy which he feels because of his own unfulfilled love for James Bower. At the end of the novel, Hart realizes that it is not necessary that these two centers of foci will unite into one. So when Grace asks Thomas Hart, how do they resolve this difference that they have? How do they resolve this enmity that they have developed? Hart says that we can love each other without forgiving all those past actions which we have done. So that is why Hart doesn't forgive Grace Macaulay for insulting him in front of everyone and accusing him of being a sinner. And on the other hand, Thomas Hart cannot forgive Grace. Grace cannot forgive Thomas Hart because Thomas Hart had turned Nathan away. So both of them have these resentments towards each other. And both of them love each other despite these feelings of resentment. So the two foci which I'm talking about, they exist independently. They determine the path along which this individual is traveling. And many a times these two focal points may act in a contradictory manner, but at the same time, they also influence the decisions which this individual is taking. So that is how the metaphor of return features in this novel. Another important part or an important way in which this metaphor features is, on the one hand, Hart has a sense of self-identity, and on the other hand, he has these social relationships which he wants to maintain. So the conflict between one's self-identity and the roles one has to perform socially can be defined by these two focal points. Hart wishes to be accepted in Bethesda Chapel and to be integrated within the religious structure. But his personal identity as a homosexual man is under direct threat from the religious doctrines of the chapel, which constantly try to depict him as a sinner. When Grace first hears about Hart's sexual orientation, she is torn between her feelings of disgust that has been instilled in her as part of a religious indoctrination. And on the other hand, there's this natural sense of affection which she feels towards him. And I'll quote this line from the novel where she says, where the narrator says, she discovered that she has sifted away from him as if her body had been trained into distaste. So this sense of distaste which she feels towards Hart is a result of her religious indoctrination, which has taught her to hate upon Hart just because of his sexual orientation. But on the other hand, Thomas Hart also has treated her as almost as a father throughout his life. That is why Grace also feels this sense of affection towards him. So both of these feelings form two separate focal points. Both of these feelings contradict each other and they cannot be resolved into one. But that is the metaphor of the elliptical orbit and the metaphor of return, which functions in this particular novel. So when we're talking about Grace Macaulay, therefore, we find that the story of enlightenment unfolds through the curiosity of Thomas Hart and his relentless pursuit of information about Maria Vadua. And the curiosity which Hart has is also it also develops through Grace Macaulay, because we find that he constantly takes Grace Macaulay to unknown places to develop her interest in unknown aspects of nature. He takes Grace Macaulay to this space where there are all these cemeteries. He tells her the histories of these places to develop a curiosity in her. So on the one hand, within her family, Grace has been taught to accept whatever dictates come from the family or come from religion. But on the other hand, Thomas Hart is also teaching her to question aspects of the universe. So both of these form important parts of the development of Grace Macaulay. And Grace Macaulay also has to repress her desires because her father tells her that it is not okay to get physically intimate with Nathan. So although she wants to explore her life with Nathan and wants to explore her sexuality as she grows up, Grace is constantly bothered by this desire to be quote unquote good. In this context, curiosity towards her own body is almost seen as a sin by his father and her aunt, who reproach her for being physically intimate with Nathan. And when Nathan questions Grace Macaulay why she doesn't watch television, why she doesn't wear jeans, and why she doesn't go to the cinema, Grace replies, and I quote, Grace said, either it was because her father said so or because God did. And as she answered, it struck her that she was often unable to tell the difference. So Grace's inability to differentiate between the dictates of her father and the dictates of religion indicate that her curiosity and her desire is constantly being monitored, controlled, and repressed by the phallic authority. Within the patriarchal structures of religion and family, she is denied the right to explore her own sexuality. On the other hand, Thomas Hart, who is himself a victim of these patriarchal, homophobic power structures that work in tandem with each other, is complicit in controlling Grace's expression of sexuality because he decides that Nathan should be turned away. He decides that Grace should not have a relationship with Nathan. So Thomas Hart, although he's a victim of these homophobic patriarchal power structures, he is also a perpetrator in the sense that he controls the expression of Grace Macaulay's sexuality. Similarly, Grace, who is kept under the control of this phallic authority of religion and family, uses these same structures to humiliate and control Hart's exploration of his homosexual desires. So Grace also is a victim and a perpetrator at the same time. So both Grace and Hart, ironically, strengthen the very forces that conspire to limit their capacity. I'll come to the last portion of this lecture, which is curiosity and the limits of knowledge. So on the one hand, we have Thomas Hart and James Bower trying to discover what had happened to Maria Vadua Bell. However, they're often unsuccessful because their curiosity is extremely purpose-driven. and it is isolated from its surrounding components. On the one hand, we have another character who is called Richard, uh, and who is a homeless man. So this homeless man discovers the diary of Maria Vadua Bell in this house. And Richard is brought home by Grace. And Richard says that I read this diary because it offers me company. So Richard is not trying to uncover the secrets of Maria Vadua. Richard is not developing his curiosity for some fixed purpose. He is just translating and reading Vadua's work because it offers him company. And when Thomas Hart sees that Richard has this diary of Maria, he asks him to translate it. And Richard realizes that James and Hart, they have these gaps in their knowledge because Maria Vadua was a Romanian woman. And this reference to M is in actuality a reference to this Romanian poet, Mihai Eminescu, which they could not decipher because they had, and I quote, no facility with the poets of any language which are not your own. So James and Hart, they have this purpose-driven sense of curiosity, but there are these gaps in their knowledge. On the other hand, Richard, who is not trying hard to actually learn what has happened to Vadua, who is just reading through the diary for the sake of the knowledge, discovers what actually has happened to her and offers a lot of information to Hart and Bauer. And because of this information, they finally discover the comet which Vadua had found all those years ago. So the division between the knower and the object knowledge is therefore completely erased. And the limits of knowledge are tested only when Thomas Hart learns that there is no external object to know, but only a reality to experience as one interconnected system of ideas, emotions, and contradictions. So at the end of the novel, when Hart is looking at Maria Vadua's comet, he realizes the materiality of his own existence. He says that this realization that he's ultimately made of matter is extremely amazing to him. And he ends the novel saying, and I quote, "Perhaps this is the wonder, Thomas, and this is the whole of the law. You are here, you are here, you are here." So Thomas Hart realizes that this sense of curiosity is not just should not just be purpose driven, but there should be this aspect of realization about one's own sense of selfhood. So looking at the cosmic space, therefore, Hart realizes how personal relationships develop across this elliptical orbit. He realizes that there's this grand experience of wonder, this sense of sublimity on watching the stars and watching the cosmic space. So this, when we had begun the novel, the first scene of the novel focused on Thomas Hart sitting at his office, sitting at his desk in his office, and preparing these newspaper articles. And the novel ends with Thomas Hart showing that once again we have come a full circle. We have covered the entire orbit, and the repetition that you are here, you are here, you are here, shows that Thomas Hart is not a man who has spent his life chasing a ghost, but a man who has been redirected to his own sense of selfhood through his curious exploration of the cosmos. Thank you.